Imagine your own mind for a second. Think about, your independence, your career, maybe your quirky habits, like the fundamental things that make you who you are.
Right, your entire sense of self.
Exactly. Now imagine taking that modern, autonomous mind and, well, forcing it to merge with a rigid 2,000-year-old state system.
Wow, yeah.
A machine that literally dictates every step you take, who you can speak to, and completely redefines your core biological purpose.
Yeah.
What actually happens to a human psyche when those two immense forces collide?
I mean, it creates an almost unimaginable psychological pressure cooker.
It really does.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we are looking at today in this deep dive. We've got a highly dense, honestly almost unsettling essay titled The Contemporary Fujitsubo, an AI portrait of a commoner consort's agony.
It is quite the read.
Yeah. And the mission for this deep dive is to deconstruct a massive societal taboo. We are examining this brutal collision between the individual and the state, specifically by looking through the very cold clinical lenses of psychopathology and dynamic psychiatry.
But before we dive into those specific clinical mechanisms, it's vital to frame how we're approaching this for you listening.
Oh, definitely.
Because the source material we are unpacking explores the Japanese Imperial family specifically, the intense psychological experiences of the women who married into it from civilian life.
Right.
And because these are highly politically charged historical and cultural themes, we are strictly and impartially reporting on the clinical theories presented by the author of the essay.
Just laying out the text.
Exactly. We are not taking sides, we aren't passing moral judgment, and we are not endorsing the viewpoints of the text. We are purely here to unpack the psychological and psychiatric analysis exactly as the author lays it out.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the first commoner to marry into this environment, Princess Michiko.
Right, back in the late 50s.
Because the way she handled this oppressive environment completely defies conventional logic. Like usually when someone is backed into a corner by a deeply toxic or oppressive system, they fight back with noise,
Oh, for sure. They leak stories, they rebel, they complain.
Yeah, but Michiko fought back with the loudest silence imaginable. It's almost like a peaceful protest that is so absolute it just deafens the entire room.
The author actually frames her psychological response through a very specific psychoanalytic lens. They call it hyperconformity and the internalization of the superego.
Hold up. Internalization of the superego. Break that down for me, because, I know Freud talked about the ego, the id, and the superego, but what does it actually mean to internalize it in this specific context?
Well, think of the superego as society's rulebook living inside your head. It's your moral compass, the internalized voice of authority, cultural norms, and all those expectations.
Okay, that makes sense.
Most of us balance that rulebook with our own personal desires and boundaries. But when Michiko entered this ancient, fiercely traditional court, she faced intense backlash and, frankly, bullying from the old guard. So the author argues that to survive, she didn't just casually follow the rules. Her psyche completely absorbed the system's crushing demands as her own absolute reality.
Wow.
And the psychological pressure was so immense that she developed what's known as a conversion disorder.
Conversion disorder.
Yeah.
Meaning, like, her psychological distress literally converted into a physical bodily symptom.
Precisely. Specifically, psychogenic aphonia.
Which means?
She literally lost her voice, her vocal cords were physically fine, there was no biological disease at all, but her brain completely prevented her from speaking.
I have to admit, I'm struggling with the author's conclusion here, because on paper, losing your voice in a toxic environment looks like the ultimate defeat, doesn't it? Like the system broke you so badly you can't even speak.
That is exactly how it looks on the surface.
Right, so how does the text argue this was somehow a victory?
Because her physical manifestation of victimhood functioned as an impenetrable shield. The author uses this beautiful but haunting comparison to a famous haiku by the poet Basho to explain this exact mechanism.
Oh, the cicada one.
Yes. Ah, the stillness. Piercing into the stones, the cicada's shrill.
Right, so the idea being that the screaming of the cicadas actually forces you to notice the heavy, absolute silence of the mountain even more.
Exactly. Her absolute silence was a silent clamor. By psychologically defaulting to absolute silence, her condition became an undeniable physical accusation.
Oh, I see.
Imagine the optics of the situation. The old guard of the court is gossiping, they're trying to tear her down, but she is physically incapable of responding. She simply suffers quietly and visibly.
Wow, that completely shifts the power dynamic.
It absolutely did. This dynamic completely shifted the power balance because it turned the public entirely to her side.
So by never actually breaking a single rule, she created a situation where her abusers look like absolute monsters.
Yes. The mechanism is brilliant because it's utterly unassailable. She executed the state's ultimate demand, too. She gave birth to 2 male heirs, Naruhito and Fumihito.
Right, checking the biggest box there is.
And by flawlessly playing by the rules, never complaining, and enduring this visible suffering, she amassed staggering public leverage.
Ah, I see. And the imperial household fundamentally relies on public reverence to exist in the modern world.
Yes, without public support, they have nothing. She was the ultimate adaptation victor, according to the text. She hacked the system by submitting to it so completely that the old, insidious traditions of the court were basically crushed under the weight of her overwhelming popular support.
So Michiko's brain allowed her to conform entirely to survive. But what happens if the brain of the next person entering the palace is fundamentally wired to reject submission?
That is the million-dollar question.
And that brings us to Princess Masako in the early 2000s, where we see the unconscious defense mechanism completely flip. Same ancient system, same intense pressures, but Michiko's strategy was submission. Masako's strategy, according to the source, was splitting.
You really have to look at the psychological foundation Masako brought into the palace, though. She was a highly successful, Harvard-educated career diplomat at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Right, a totally different background.
Totally. She possessed a very robust, established ego identity. She knew exactly who she was, she valued her intellect, and she was accustomed to having high-level agency over her life.
And then she steps into a world where that entire identity is practically wiped out. The text bluntly describes her new role as a male production machine.
It is a harsh term, but that is the clinical reality of the institution.
Her intellectual career is just gone, and even her bedroom privacy and choices around childbirth are heavily managed as state acts.
Just imagine the psychological shock of that confinement for someone like her. Every aspect of your existence, your most intimate biological functions, they no longer belong to you. They belong to the state.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the mainstream media narrative for years, what you and I read in the news, was that Masako was simply suffering from an adjustment disorder due to the stress of palace life.
Right, a very common, almost dismissive label.
Exactly. But reading this clinical analysis, that label feels entirely inadequate. Diagnosing her with adjustment disorder is like diagnosing a catastrophic engine explosion as a minor oil leak.
That is a perfect analogy.
So I want to push back on that media narrative.
Yeah.
The author is describing a massive clash between modern medicine and the deep human unconscious, aren't they? It's like trying to fix a hardware failure with a tiny software patch.
What's fascinating here is how the essay elevates this far beyond a simple stress response. The author actually places her condition on the dissociative disorder spectrum.
Which is much more severe.
We aren't talking about a woman just feeling overwhelmed by a new job. The text suggests her unconscious mind, her id, the primal, survival-driven part of the psyche, realized that to survive the total annihilation of her ego identity, it had to literally split the self.
Man. The text mentions she experienced fragmented memory, literally losing time during her long recuperation. How does that mechanism work? Why does the brain just erase time like that?
That is a classic manifestation of dissociative amnesia. When reality becomes too toxic or too traumatizing for the conscious mind to process, the brain actively shuts down its own perception of that reality.
Like blowing a fuse to save the house.
Exactly. It walls off the trauma to protect the core self. This, however, created a monumental dilemma for the biological psychiatrists treating her.
Right, because they are looking at her symptoms and thinking, okay, major depression, let's give her an SSRI like Paxil, which was a booming treatment at the time.
But they were walking a terrifying tightrope there.
How so?
Well, you have a patient in profound psychological distress who desperately needs pharmaceutical intervention. But you're also creating a woman whose singular state-mandated duty is to produce a male heir. Prescribing heavy psychotropics carries massive risks of birth defects and severe withdrawal.
Oh, wow, so they were totally trapped. But the wild part is that, according to the author, Masako's unconscious mind completely bypassed the doctors and the medication anyway, right? It didn't matter what drugs they gave her.
It didn't matter at all. Her unconscious mind recognized that the only way to fight a system demanding a physical product, a male heir, was to physically shut down the factory.
The text calls it an unconscious hunger strike.
Yeah.
That is such a heavy, heavy concept.
It really is.
Like, she didn't call a press conference. She didn't consciously plan a rebellion. Her mind's simply decoupled from her body,
Right.
shutting everything down as a biological failsafe so the system just couldn't use her.
Yes. By falling into this severe dissociative state, she successfully blocked the pipeline of male heirs. She paralyzed the core demand of the institution without ever having to speak a single word of defiance.
It's an incredible defense mechanism. But when you have a psychological explosion of that magnitude, you can't just contain it to one person, right?
No, you absolutely cannot.
In a closed, pressurized environment like a palace, that kind of trauma is inevitably going to spill over. And the essay goes into chilling detail about Princess Aiko and this concept of intergenerational transmission.
Dynamic psychiatry always looks at the family unit as a connected system. You cannot isolate the mother's mental state from the child's psychological development.
Right, they feed into each other.
The author suggests that beneath Masako's dissociative presentation, there was likely severe postpartum depression, massively compounded by the environmental suppression of the palace.
And if a mother is trapped in a state of deep dissociation, if she's literally split and shut down, how does that affect the infant?
It devastates the maternal-infant attachment bond. The essay utilizes Mary Ainsworth's clinical concept of disorganized attachment to explain this.
So break that down for me. What does disorganized attachment actually look like in practice for a child?
Well, a secure attachment means the child sees the caregiver as a safe haven. But in an environment fueled by severe postpartum depression and institutional paranoia, the dynamic often becomes a terrifying mix of overprotection and hidden hostility, or just profound emotional absence.
That sounds confusing for a kid.
It's incredibly confusing. The caregiver is simultaneously the source of comfort and the source of fear. For a developing infant, this creates an unresolvable paradox. The child's internal model for relationships becomes fractured, anxious, and deeply unstable.
See, I really want to question the official story we've all been fed about Aiko here, because the media heavily reported on Princess Aiko's school refusal, and they sanitized it by labeling it as simple bullying.
Yes, that was the predominant narrative.
But looking at this clinical breakdown, calling it bullying makes zero sense. What was actually happening in that classroom, according to the source?
It wasn't bullying in the playground sense of kids stealing her lunch money or calling her names. The author describes the mechanism as profound alienation caused by excessive deference.
Wow. Alienation by excessive deference. What does that actually mean for an 8-year-old?
Put yourself in the shoes of a young boy in that classroom. You have been drilled by your parents, your teachers, and the entire culture that you are sitting next to a member of the Imperial family.
Right.
You absolutely cannot make a mistake. You cannot be rude. You cannot play too rough. The result of that pressure is sheer terror.
So instead of treating her like a normal classmate, they treat her like a bomb that might go off if they say the wrong thing.
Precisely. So they actively avoided her. They backed away and created a vacuum. This wasn't malicious teasing. It was an eerie, absolute silence that surrounded Aiko.
Man, it's like dark poetry. The silent clamor of the mother's unconscious hunger strike inside the palace echoes perfectly into the next generation. The silence of the palace literally followed the daughter into the classroom.
That is the devastating reality of intergenerational transmission. The institutional structure didn't just break the person currently trapped within it. It actively eroded the psychological foundation and the social environment of the child, too.
Which leads me to a very logical question, I think. If the doctors treating Masako knew she was suffering, if they could clearly see the dissociation and the negative impact on her child, why did her recuperation stall for over a decade? Why couldn't they just adjust the SSRIs and help her get better?
Because the source of the illness wasn't merely chemical, it was temporal.
Temporal.
Yes, the answer lies in her biological clock, bringing us into biological psychiatry.
Okay, I need to relate this to everyday life for a second. We all know how awful we feel when we get a terrible night's sleep, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Think about the last time you took a massive red-eye flight across 5 time zones. Your brain is absolute mush, you feel physically sick, and your mood is completely unstable.
Yeah.
You are barely a functioning human. But the essay argues that the Imperial Palace takes circadian rhythm disruption to an inescapable pathological extreme.
It does. The author introduces a profound concept here called dynastic time.
Dynastic time. What separates that from normal time?
Well, we all operate on an innate human circadian rhythm. Our bodies expect a natural cycle of day and night, rest and activity. But palace life demands the forced synchronization of the human biological body to ancient, unyielding rituals.
So we're talking about, like, forced early morning awakenings for purification rituals, staying up late for specific ceremonies, and this is 365 days a year.
Exactly. A relentless schedule where you literally do not own your own time. The chronic terror inflicted on the biological rhythm triggers a complex matrix of dysthymia, which is a persistent, long-term depressive disorder and circadian rhythm disorder.
So it actually rewires your brain.
Yes. The essay places this entirely on the bipolar spectrum.
So trying to treat this with an SSRI antidepressant is like trying to fix a delicate mechanical watch by pouring oil on it while strapping it to a paint shaker. It doesn't matter how much chemical help you give the gears, the violent environmental shaking is just going to keep breaking the mechanism.
That is a visceral but highly accurate metaphor. You can flood the brain's receptors with all the Paxil in the world, but it is fundamentally useless if the patient has to wake up every single day inside a courtly temporal structure.
Yeah.
The environment itself is essentially a 24/7 glitch-generating machine. The environment is the pathogen.
So what does this all mean? We've looked at two totally distinct paths of psychological warfare against a massive state apparatus.
Very different paths, yeah.
We have Princess Michiko, who triumphs over the system via hyperconformity, turning flawless submission into unassailable political leverage. And then we have Princess Masako, who paralyzed the system's lineage through an unconscious dissociative boycott. It's a stark reminder to you listening of how massive institutions can structurally destroy the fundamental pillars of human survival: a person's time, their ego identity, and their capacity for human attachment.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it explains why you have likely never encountered this depth of clinical analysis in the mainstream media. The author notes a crucial barrier called the Goldwater Rule.
Right, the ethical guideline that prohibits psychiatrists from diagnosing public figures they haven't personally evaluated.
Exactly. Any active psychiatrist who publicly spoke these brutal clinical truths about the Imperial family would face social liquidation. They would lose their licenses and face immediate media bans.
So no one talks about it.
Right. Consequently, public intellectuals are forced to hide behind empty euphemisms.
They dilute the reality. They say she's on the brink of overwork or experiencing adjustment issues, putting this polite veil over an absolute psychological battlefield.
They have to just to survive professionally.
But when you strip away the euphemisms, you see the devastating human cost of forcing a modern mind into an ancient machine. Which leaves a lingering question for you to explore on your own. If rigid ancient institutions inevitably force the modern human minds within them into either total psychological submission or total dissociative rebellion, well, at what point do these systems become fundamentally unsustainable in the modern psychological landscape?